It feels like Syria's a powder keg right now and someone just lit the fuse.
Yeah.
Rebels are pushing towards Damascus.
Yeah.
And it's like nothing we've seen in years. It's shaking up the whole region.
It really is.
I mean, you sent me a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
Reports, statements, even someone's like firsthand account from inside Damascus.
Oh, wow.
Seriously gripping stuff. So we need to unpack all of it. Like, why does this offensive feel so different? And then what could this even mean for Syria's future? Big questions.
It's definitely a pivotal moment. I mean, we've seen rebels make a push before.
Right.
But this time, this one has this intensity. And the coordination, too. It's got people all over the world watching very, very closely.
So let's get to it. Who are these rebels? We keep hearing this name, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS.
Right.
They're the group with ties to al-Qaeda, right?
That's right, yeah. HTS has a really complicated history.
Yeah.
They went from being, like, directly tied to al-Qaeda to now being this more independent entity.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, a lot of people debate exactly how much they've actually changed.
Right.
And to really get what's happening here, we have to understand their ideology.
That's a good point.
Like, they've managed to get all these different rebel groups fighting together under this military operations command.
Wow. But is that like real unity or just a temporary thing? You know, only time will tell.
I mean, because if they win this thing, it's not just about Assad anymore.
Right.
It's about what comes next. It's about who takes over and how they rule.
Exactly. It's their ideology that has everyone worried, really.
Okay, that makes sense.
And you know what's interesting is that they've said they're going to protect UN offices and other international organizations.
Really?
Yeah, and that's a surprise. Is that them, like, actually becoming more moderate or just trying to look good for the rest of the world? It's hard to say for sure.
It's like they're trying to rebrand themselves.
Yeah. While they're fighting a war, I mean, they've been really successful on the battlefield. They've gone across north and south Syria. They took Aleppo and Hama.
Wow.
Now they're surrounding Damascus.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
They're bold. They're coordinated. It's like someone flipped a switch, and now the rebels are a serious force.
Exactly.
This lightning offensive, that's what people are calling it, is important for a few reasons. First, they're not just holding ground. They're moving forward.
Right.
They're going right for the center of Assad's power.
It's like a direct challenge.
Yeah, they took Dara and Kanaker, which means they're really close to Damascus now, and that's causing a lot of panic.
Yeah.
We haven't seen this level of panic in years.
I can only imagine. Which reminds me, we got that firsthand account from that person in Damascus.
Oh, right.
It's like a window into what's happening on the ground there.
Absolutely. Their description of Damascus is like a snapshot. Shops are closed. They're running out of food. It's hard to get in touch with anyone. They can just feel the fear in the air. And get this, they even said they saw soldiers changing into regular clothes.
Really? Wow.
Well, they're trying to blend in.
Yeah.
It makes you think maybe morale is really low, or maybe they're even quietly retreating. And that goes against what the Syrian military is saying.
Of course, they're denying it.
Right.
So who do you believe?
It just shows how confusing the situation is.
It's like a fog of war has settled over Damascus. It's hard to know what's real and what's not. But I don't know, this offensive, it feels different.
It does.
What makes this one more important than the other times the rebels have tried this?
There are a couple things happening at once. First, the rebels are working together.
Okay.
Like really strategically.
Interesting.
Which they haven't done before.
Huh.
They're not just fighting, they're thinking ahead, they're surrounding their enemies, and they're putting pressure on from all sides.
That's smart.
Which tells us that there's some real unity, some strong leadership.
Okay.
And that could be what changes everything.
It's not just the rebels, though, right?
Right.
There are all these other countries involved.
We got it.
All with their own goals, their own agendas.
The Syrian civil war has turned into this proxy war, you know? It's like Russia, Turkey, Iran, the U.S., they're all pulling strings.
And that makes things even more complicated.
Yeah, to really understand what's happening.
Yeah.
You need to understand why those countries are doing what they're doing.
Okay, so let's get into that. Erdogan's saying that Turkey doesn't want to take land from Syria.
Right.
They just want peace for their neighbor. But you have to remember, they've got a ton of Syrian refugees.
A huge number.
I mean, it's a big deal for them. And then you have Lavrov, who's basically saying Russia's not backing down. They're going to keep supporting Assad no matter what.
Yeah, it's like they're doubling down.
Even with the rebels this close to Damascus.
It shows how high the stakes are.
And for everyone involved.
Russia sees Syria as super important.
Right.
For their position in the Middle East, and just symbolically, too.
Mm-hmm.
They've spent a lot of resources propping up Assad, and they're not going to give up easily.
So what you're saying is Russia's not going anywhere.
Not anytime soon.
But then you have the Qatari prime minister saying that Assad missed his chance for peace.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Like he could have fixed things.
Right.
And now it's too late.
He blew it, according to him, and that just made the war worse.
So maybe this was avoidable.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what if?
It does make you wonder.
So we've got rebels with a complicated past who are suddenly winning, a capital city that could fall any day, and all these other countries with their own agendas all mixed up in this.
That's a lot.
To really grasp what's happening,
Right.
I think we need to go back to the start. Like, how did we even get here?
Yeah, looking back can help us make sense of today.
The roots of this conflict go way back. It's a long and complicated story. So let's rewind back to 2011. The Arab Spring, right? It's all over the Middle East. And people in Syria start protesting. They want change. They want a say in their government. And how does Assad respond?
Violence.
Brutal crackdown.
That's what started it all.
That's the spark that set everything on fire. Assad chose violence instead of listening.
Right.
And that's how this whole civil war got started.
His decision tore the country apart.
And then, like, out of all that chaos, all these different groups pop up.
Right.
Each with their own goals. You've got the Free Syrian Army and a bunch of different Islamist groups and Kurdish militias.
And, of course, ISIS.
Right, ISIS.
Yeah.
They used all that chaos to take over land for themselves.
The war basically became this magnet for extremists. It just created this perfect storm of violence and instability.
That makes sense.
And as if things weren't bad enough.
Right.
You have these other countries seeing an opportunity to get involved.
It's like everyone wants a piece of Syria.
Yeah, it becomes this battleground for global power.
And then you have the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF.
Right, backed by the U.S.
Mainly Kurdish fighters, right? And they were a big part of defeating ISIS. But they also want their own independent area in northeast Syria.
Yeah.
It's like this layer cake of different groups.
Yeah.
All wanting their own slice.
Everyone wants control.
Don't forget about those ceasefires, too. Russia and Turkey tried to make peace a few times, but they never really lasted.
Yeah, like in Idlib in 2020.
Right.
That was supposed to stabilize things.
It was just a temporary fix.
Yeah, it was like putting a Band-Aid on a really, really deep wound.
Exactly. And then, bam, this new rebel coalition shows up.
Out of nowhere, it seems.
Yeah.
The Military Operations Command.
And they're shaking things up.
Big time.
They're offensive. It changes everything.
It really does. Suddenly, anything is possible. It reminds us that things can change fast in Syria.
Yeah.
New groups are forming, old fights are coming back, and the balance of power can shift just like that.
It's honestly kind of overwhelming.
It is.
So is this a real turning point or just another bloody chapter in a long, long war?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And to get the answer, we have to look closer.
Okay.
At what's happening, at what could happen, and what this offensive really means in the long run.
Okay, so this is where things get even more interesting. We've set the scene.
Yeah.
Now we got to figure out what happens next.
Exactly.
And what it all means for Syria.
And for the world.
We'll be right back to do exactly that. We'll be exploring the possibilities, the geopolitical forces at play, all the stuff that's shaping the future of this war-torn nation. Stay with us.
So we're talking about, like, what happens now Damascus falls?
Yeah.
It'd be a huge deal.
Huge.
But would it really be a win for the rebels?
That's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
Taking a city,
Right.
even the capital,
Yeah.
it's one thing, but actually running a whole country, especially Syria. I mean, it's been through so much.
Exactly. You're talking about a country that's been completely destroyed by war.
Right.
Deeply divided.
Yeah.
With a wrecked economy, no infrastructure.
It's a mess.
A total mess.
Yeah.
The rebels would inherit a nightmare, even if they all stayed united.
Yeah, I can see that.
And don't forget, Assad's forces aren't just going to disappear.
Right. They've got Russia backing them up.
Exactly. They'd probably regroup, dig in, and we could end up with years of fighting, even if Damascus falls.
So it's like winning might just be the start of a whole new set of problems.
Right.
And then there's the Syrian people.
Yeah.
I mean, millions of them have been displaced.
Millions.
Yeah.
Inside the country, and refugees, too.
So many refugees. Would a rebel win even bring them home? Would it even bring peace?
It's tough to say.
Yeah.
For a lot of Syrians, especially those who ran from Assad, a rebel victory might seem like hope.
Right.
But realistically, any change in power in a place like Syria is dangerous.
Yeah, it could just make things worse.
Violence could flare up again, people wanting revenge. Those are real threats.
It's scary to think about.
And rebuilding a country, physically and mentally,
Yeah.
that's going to take generations.
That's a long time. Okay, so we've talked about the rebels, but what about the international scene?
Right.
We know Russia really wants Assad to stay in power.
They do.
So what if he loses? Do they just step back or do they double down?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Russia's response is the wild card. They've put their reputation on the line for Assad.
Okay.
And losing in Syria would make them look weak.
They don't want that.
No, they don't. They could send in more military support, maybe even get directly involved.
That would be a huge escalation.
It would. And that could pull the whole region into a bigger conflict.
Yeah.
Or, and this is less likely, they could try to negotiate.
Okay.
Try to keep some influence without losing more.
It's like everyone's playing this high-stakes game.
It is.
And Syria's the chessboard.
Yeah. And the Syrian people are the ones caught in the middle.
It's easy to forget that with all this talk of geopolitics and strategy.
It's important to remember that this is about people's lives.
Real people, families.
Yeah.
Their country's been torn apart.
And they just want peace.
We can't lose sight of that.
Absolutely. And that's why we need to understand what the key players want.
Right. Especially if Assad loses.
Especially then.
Yeah.
We need to know who might take his place.
Okay, that brings us back to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
HTS.
Yeah.
We have to look at their ideology.
Right, because remember they said they'd protect UN offices?
Yeah, and be a stabilizing force. A lot of people were skeptical.
I mean, they have a pretty extreme past.
They do.
So are they changing, or is this just for show?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
HTS comes from a really extreme place.
Right, Al-Qaeda.
Even if they've broken away, their core beliefs are still a concern.
Like, what does that mean for how they'd run the country?
How would they treat people who don't agree with them? That's what everyone's worried about.
It's like we're trying to predict the future.
It is. And the fact that we're even talking about a group like this potentially being in charge just shows how unpredictable this whole thing is.
Exactly. So what could a Syria ruled by HTS look like?
Well, would they try to impose strict religious laws?
Yeah.
Would they respect minority groups? These are important questions.
Yeah.
And the possibility of more violence, more human rights abuses, it's a real worry.
It's a pretty grim picture.
It's not good. A group with a history of violence taking over a country that's already been devastated by war.
It's hard to imagine a happy ending.
I agree. We have to be realistic.
Yeah.
We can't be naive about what could happen if HTS takes control.
But we also can't rule out the possibility that they might surprise us.
That's true.
They could govern differently than we expect.
It's possible.
We just have to wait and see.
We do.
It feels like we're at a crossroads.
Yeah.
There are so many paths Syria could take.
There are.
Some better than others.
Maybe HTS will become more moderate, more willing to share power.
Okay.
Or maybe they'll be even stricter, impose their beliefs, and make the fighting worse.
And there are a million possibilities in between.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the whole picture.
The history.
Yeah, the politics.
The ideologies.
All of it. We can't just simplify things.
Okay, I get it.
The Syrian civil war is messy and complicated.
It is.
We have to accept that.
Okay, deep breath. We've talked about Damascus falling, the global implications, HTS's ideology, but we haven't talked about Assad himself.
True.
I mean, what's he doing? Is he just waiting for the rebels to make a mistake?
Maybe.
Or does he have a plan to fight back?
That's a good question. We should explore that. Assad might be in trouble.
He is.
But he's also tough and he's smart. We can't forget that. He's survived this long.
You're right, he has. So maybe he's not done yet.
Maybe not.
Okay, let's try to figure out what Assad might do next.
Let's do it. What's his strategy? What's his end game? We'll be back in a minute to dive into that and figure out what might be going on in his head.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the rebels and what they want and how they might win this thing. But let's be real, we can't ignore Bashar al-Assad.
Good.
This is a guy who's held onto power for years.
A long time.
Through a brutal civil war.
He's defied the odds.
Everyone thought he was finished so many times.
And he always comes back.
So what's he thinking now? What's his plan?
It's easy to think he's trapped.
Yeah.
Desperate.
But he's always got another trick up his sleeve.
Yeah, I think that underestimates him. He's smart. He still controls important parts of the country. He's got a loyal military, and he has Russia on his side.
That's a powerful friend.
It is. He's survived a lot, and he probably thinks he can survive this too.
So you're saying he could still pull this off?
He might.
Even with the rebels right there?
Yeah, he might have a plan.
Okay, I'm listening.
One thing he could do is try to drag the rebels into a fight in Damascus itself.
Oh, like urban warfare.
Exactly. Street to street.
That's brutal.
It is, but it gives the defender an advantage.
Especially in a city like Damascus. It's like a maze.
It would be chaos.
And Assad could use that to his advantage.
He might think so. Wear them down, inflict a lot of casualties, and try to stop their advance.
It would be a bloodbath, though.
Especially for civilians.
Exactly.
And that's the terrible thing about this war. Assad hasn't cared about civilian casualties before.
He hasn't.
He might even be counting on it.
What do you mean?
He might be betting that the rest of the world is tired of this war.
They are tired of it.
And that they won't intervene even if Damascus turns into a nightmare.
That's a scary thought.
It is, but it fits with how he's acted before.
It does.
He's hoping the world will look away while he crushes the rebellion.
No matter the cost. What about Russia? What are they going to do? Are they going to watch from the sidelines or get more involved?
That's hard to say. Russia wants to be powerful in the Middle East.
Syria is important to them.
It is, strategically.
Right.
But it's also about sending a message.
To the West.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're still a major player. Don't underestimate us.
Okay, I get it. It's like a power move.
Yeah.
So if the rebels keep winning, if Assad's really losing, would Russia actually risk a fight with Turkey?
Or the U.S.
Yeah.
That's the big question. Putin's a gambler.
He is.
He takes risks. If he thinks losing Syria is a disaster for Russia, he might escalate things.
Like what?
He could send more weapons, maybe even Russian troops.
Wow. That would be a game changer.
It would.
Yeah.
But it's a risky move.
It feels like everything's about to explode.
It does. We've covered a lot. The rebels, Damascus, Russia, the U.S. Everything's so uncertain.
It is.
But what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
That's a good question.
What's the key takeaway from all of this?
I think it's that the Syrian civil war is a tragedy, and there are no easy solutions.
Right.
It's a war fueled by people hating each other, by other countries interfering.
Yeah.
And nobody seems to care about the Syrian people. It's heartbreaking. It's too easy to say one side is good and the other is bad.
It is.
But it's just not that simple. This is a complicated situation.
Absolutely.
And we have to understand that to make any sense of it.
We do. The Syrian people deserve that.
I agree. We have to remember that real people are suffering. Their lives have been destroyed.
And that shouldn't be forgotten.
It shouldn't.
So let's not oversimplify things.
Right.
Let's try to understand the truth, even if it's hard.
And let's hope for peace.
Absolutely.
So that's our deep dive into the Syrian rebel offensive. It's a story that's still being written. We'll be watching closely to see what happens next. Thanks for listening.